Thank you. So my name is Emma Johnston. I'm an analyst in the Safety, Culture, and Governance section at the CPUC. And this is our second technical working group meeting for the proceeding R.21-10-001. And this meeting is on collaboration for safety culture. I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping items. So like I said, this is the second technical working group meeting for this proceeding, and the goal of this proceeding is to develop and adopt a safety culture assessment framework and process for regulated investor-owned and electric and natural gas utilities that in fulfillment of SB 901 and other commission safety oversight responsibilities. After this technical working group meeting, we'll have two more later this summer in July. And today's meeting objective is to try and answer these two questions that we have on the slide. So the first question is, how can the Commission develop an approach for improving safety culture that provides greater opportunity for collaboration among regulators and regulated industry representatives? And then the second is, what mechanisms could be used in such implementation that ensure accountability through coordination and collaboration, as opposed to a framework based primarily on a protectionist-centered model? This is just a quick overview of our agenda for today. So we're here for 3 hours. I realize that it's a Friday afternoon, so we'll try to keep things engaging to the extent possible and let you all get on with your weekend after. And here are just some virtual meeting guidelines. So as you notice, the meeting is being recorded, and we'll send out the recording as well as the slides after the meeting. If you have questions, feel free to raise your hand, and I'll have a slide in a second that shows you where that button is. Or you can just type your questions directly into the chat. We'll have Q&A sessions throughout the presentations, and then a little bit longer of a discussion towards the end of the workshop. And if there's any questions that we don't get to, our staff will be sure to try and answer those after the meeting. Some guidelines for engagement. So we started on time, and we're going to try to end on time and stick to our agenda. We encourage people to participate. So if you're someone that doesn't speak up a lot in meetings, feel free to push yourself to speak more. We love to hear all of your questions as you come up with them. Share the floor and try to be succinct and get to your point so that other people have the opportunity to speak. And then lastly, just be respectful. Remember, one person talking at a time, and try to engage in constructive conflict. So basically respond to people's ideas and not the person themselves. And then we also have IT support here. So if you have any IT related questions, you can send them to Jorge. And then lastly, this is just another virtual housekeeping visual. So you can see you have your mute and unmute buttons at the bottom of the screen, and your raise and lower hand buttons, as well as your chat button. And now I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Houck for opening remarks, and then I'll pass it to Director Thomas Jacobs from the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety after.
Thank you, Emma. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the second technical workshop in Rulemaking 21-10-001. I appreciate everyone's participation and look forward to hearing about the various approaches to implementing safety culture using a collaborative approach. I also want to thank Administrative Law Judge Rizzo, Saeed Baghari, and Emma Johnston of the Safety Policy Division for their work on this proceeding and organizing today's working group, as well as the other technical working group meetings that we're having in this series. I'd also like to thank the utility representatives and Dr. Schulman for the presentations that you're going to hear today. The purpose, again, of this rulemaking is to develop a safety culture assessment framework and processes that improve the organization-wide safety culture of the electric and investor-owned utilities regulated by the PUC. With this proceeding, we intend to provide guidance on the form and content of IOU safety culture assessments, a venue for review of organizational safety culture, and process for ongoing review of safety culture assessments in future years. Today's presentation and discussion is part of, again, a series of working groups that we're sponsoring to begin the process of assessing and improving safety culture at the PUC, an introduction as we begin this rulemaking. And this is for both gas and electric utilities. The goal of today's workshop is to share and consider ways to increase opportunities for collaboration as we implement safety culture assessments. And as we've learned from previous workshops, a collaborative approach rather than a protectionist-centered model can be much more successful and efficiently and effectively implemented and results in sustainable improvements to safety culture. I look forward to hearing from both the utilities today and Dr. Schulman today regarding their ideas on how to move forward towards a more collaborative approach as opposed to the traditional regulatory models we have previously used, while still maintaining effective carrots and sticks that ideally result in safer operations and better safety for everyone. We have an opportunity through this proceeding to reframe how we conduct enforcement that examines both the utilities and the commission practices, an opportunity to re-envision what safety management means in the face of the reliability, extreme weather events, and affordability challenges that we're currently facing. So with that, I look forward to continuing to work with everyone, the investor-owned utilities, local governments, ratepayer advocates, community interest groups, and community members, the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety, and our commission staff throughout this rulemaking and through the technical workshops that we're doing for this summer. And again, I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone today, and we'll pass back to Emma.
Thank you, Commissioner. So we also are lucky to have Director Thomas Jacobs from the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety here with us today, and I will pass it on to you for some opening comments.
Thank you, Emma. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Commissioner Haug, for the invitation to join. Really appreciate the opportunity to join in the discussion today and get to hear all of the stakeholders' input. So our office, as many folks here in this meeting are aware, the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety was established last year as a new department under the Natural Resources Agency alongside CAL FIRE. And we are tasked with conducting an annual safety culture assessment of the 8, soon to be 9 electrical corporations in California. The annual safety culture assessment requirement was created by Assembly Bill 1054 within the larger wildfire legislative package. And last year, 2021, was the first year it was in effect. And we, as such, we Energy Safety completed our first assessments last summer. Our efforts obviously have a role in building into the Commission's larger 5-year safety culture assessments. So I wanted to offer a couple thoughts from our current approach conducting these assessments for the discussion today. Our department's overarching mission for electrical infrastructure is overseeing and enforcing wildfire safety. Our department also has a separate mission for underground infrastructure, which also plays a role in safety culture, but is not directly relevant to today's conversation. So with this focus on wildfire safety, our assessment purposely has expanded the assessments to include both traditional worker health and safety considerations and an assessment of whether the company's culture incorporates an understanding of its broader impact on public safety, in our case, wildfire safety. I've heard this referred to in different ways, including process safety. Did have an opportunity to participate in the kickoff meeting back in March, which I believe this was addressed, and we had staff attend the first technical working group meeting, which I know discussed this as well. So this differentiation has been discussed in previous meetings, and I look forward to hearing how folks consider this differentiation within the context of collaboration and coordination as posed in the questions for this meeting. Also in our effort assessing annual safety culture, it is paramount that we reassess our own broader culture around how we address safety. This goes to the heart of the 2 questions that are posed today. How do we reorient the relationship between regulators and regulated entities to drive safety improvement? In our department, the legislature has structurally separated us from penalty enforcement, which has provided us a unique opportunity to establish energy safety's primary purpose, a purpose squarely focused on improving wildfire safety outcomes. Direct and open and honest communication is a foundational component to effective coordination, and it will be critical in our shared efforts to consciously establish ways to affect this open communication and collaboration to ensure we're maximizing our collective impact on driving improved safety outcomes. I'll leave it there for now, and look forward to today's discussion and continuing to work with all of you in developing how we move forward on safety culture assessment and ensuring that it is meaningful and productive effort. And again, thank you, Commissioner Houck, and to the Commission staff for the close collaboration that we have had on safety culture assessments. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Emma.
Thank you, Director. So next, we're going to provide just a brief overview of some collaborative approaches for safety culture. I'm going to give a presentation first, and then I'll pass it over to Dr. Schulman to give a presentation. So the safety policy presentation is really focused on some lessons that we learned from other regulators and ideas that we had for collaboration based on those lessons that we learned from other regulators. So I think we mentioned this in the first workshop, but we've done some meetings with these other regulators and like a small literature review to try to understand and learn from best practices that we've seen in other industries. Just a quick note that a lot of this workshop stems at least in part from Dr. Schulman's presentation at the kickoff workshop, where he outlined these two approaches for safety culture assessment. Commissioner Houck also referred to these two approaches in her opening comments. So I wanted to sort of leave this slide here for a second as sort of like a grounding so that we can think about the one approach based on compliance and accountability, and then the other approach based on continuous learning. And I'm sure Dr. Schulman will talk more about this in his presentation. Keeping in mind the learning-based approach presented on the previous slide, we see that organizations commonly include this concept of continuous learning as a key domain in their safety culture frameworks. So across industries, across nuclear, offshore oil and gas, there's different words to describe it, but continuous learning is just like a critical part of these frameworks. Last week, we also talked about the concept from the IAEA that each entity is the owner of its safety culture. That being said, we also know that introducing safety culture into regulatory language can be a driving force towards safety improvement. And one example of that we have presented on this slide is that in the Norway offshore oil and gas industry, by creating a requirement for the industry to have a health and safety culture, the industry strive for new ways to improve safety. So the regulator didn't prescribe exactly what the industry should do, and that allowed the industry to have the creativity to think of new ways to structure safety programs. So in our meeting with other regulators, the Safety Policy Division encountered some common themes for collaboration, and I'll dive into a few of these in the following slides. So at a high level, the lessons that we've learned are to start with engagement, to clarify expectations and build a shared understanding of safety culture. We talked a lot about this at the first workshop, so we won't bore you with it today. The second is to try after doing that initial engagement, it's great to continue to do ongoing and regular meetings with the industry. Next, we learned to share resources and guidance to support industry-initiated efforts in assessment, to collect safety culture insights during inspections, audits, and on-site visits, and then to establish mechanisms for information sharing across industry and government. Over and over again, we talk about the Canadian Energy Regulator, which has conducted, something that we learned from them is that they conduct quarterly meetings with the industry to discuss safety culture trends and to share information on progress on safety culture initiatives. The goal of these meetings is to foster an environment of trust, and work together to discuss safety culture progress. So not to like point out issues, but to work together to solve potential gaps and prevent harm. Learning from the Canadian Energy Regulator, in part, the Canadian Nuclear Energy Commission is looking to do the same to establish these quarterly meetings for working together. Separately, from Contra Costa County Health Services Hazardous Materials Program, we learned about public meetings, so as opposed to meetings that are between the regulator and the regulated industry. These are public meetings where progress on safety culture assessments is shared in like a transparent venue. So the public, the industry, and the regulator all have the opportunity to learn about the safety culture journey that the industry is taking on. So they do this after the assessments, and then they also do this annually. So again, the Canadian Energy Regulator has produced a lot of guidance on safety culture, and they presented some of this information at the March 11th workshop. Something that we learned from them is that they take this a step further into actually measuring the effectiveness of their own efforts. So in addition to providing resources, they're also seeing how effective those resources are at actually supporting the industry that they regulate. And they found that 65% of those regulated entities say that the CER resources have contributed to or influenced their organization's safety culture advancement efforts. And there's an increasing percentage of companies that have allocated resources to promote safety culture advancement since they started their efforts several years ago. The next example that we have is about collecting safety culture insights during inspections, audits, and on-site visits. And there are a few regulators that we provide as examples on this slide. And while they're all at a different phase in this process, they share a similar goal, which is to try and add a cultural lens to inspections, safety management systems, audits, and site visits, basically trying to understand the why of why certain cultural gaps might exist instead of just examining what's happening. And the goal of this is to collect information not just from reports or from briefings, but from a variety of sources to understand safety culture risks and trends over time. Lastly, from PHMSA, we actually heard that they are in the process of, they had a working group that was recommended establishing a voluntary information sharing platform based on the model of the Federal Aviation Administration. So the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, worked with commercial aviation to create a platform in 2007 for voluntarily reporting data from air carrier and repair station employees, and then also flight data that would reveal precursors to potential safety hazards. And the PHMSA working group recommended establishing a similar platform with the same or similar protections for confidentiality and non-punitive reporting. The interesting thing about the FAA platform is that it's hosted by a third party. And while at first it had some issues with people not necessarily trusting the platform, eventually it garnered widespread adoption and now is widely used to anticipate potential safety risks. And the goal of these voluntary information sharing platforms is to get a high volume of high quality data information to reduce accidents and incidents. And also something that was interesting to learn about in the previous slide is, so we're asking other regulators what they're doing to learn from them, and they oftentimes refer us to other regulators who have done a lot of work. So in addition to us in the industry collaborating, we're learning to collaborate more with these other regulators and find new ways to learn from them. So given all that we've learned, the Safety Policy Division proposes some similar ideas to advance collaboration. So the first is to host regular safety culture meetings with regulated entities. So potentially we could host quarterly or biannual meetings with each individual IOU to understand trends and progress and think about ways to take action as a result. We could convene annual workshops across the industry with academics and other specialists to share best practices. And we could host annual meetings with board of directors and executive leaderships to report to the commission on safety performance and safety culture. We could incorporate safety culture observations into ongoing inspections and audits. So we could train staff to collect data on safety culture indicators during inspections so that we have a better sense of potential precursors to hazardous events. And we could use this data to build a more robust understanding of these safety culture indicators beyond what's reported in safety performance metrics. Through those meetings, we could develop mechanisms for following up or monitoring actions from these inspections and audits. Next, we could provide better resources for safety culture best practices. So after sharing and clarifying expectations in a safety culture policy statement, framework, and guidance, we can also work to continue to build partnerships between regulated entities, the CPUC, academia, sister agencies, and related industry to further develop tools and provide practical guidance. And then lastly, we can continue to establish mechanisms for information sharing, both with the industry and with our sister agencies, and make sure that we have mechanisms for voluntary, non-punitive information sharing. And these are the resources or the references for the slides that I presented. And unless there's any clarifying questions for my presentation, I will pass it on to Dr. Schulman, but I'll pause for a second. And we'll have a longer question and answer session after Dr. Schulman's presentation. Okay. So next I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Schulman. So Dr. Schulman is a professor emeritus of government at Mills College, a senior research associate at the Center for Catastrophic Risk Management at UC Berkeley. And he has written extensively on managing hazardous technical systems to high levels of reliability and safety within organizations and across networks of organizations. Oh,
Is this okay?
Yeah, it's okay. Either way works for me. And he's been a consultant to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the California Independent System Operator, the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and others. He was also an advisor to the California Public Utilities Commission's Office of the Safety Advocate. And I will pass it on to you, Dr. Schulman.
Thank you. So let's see here. I'm trying to, sorry. Thank you. And I can't resist saying that the staff proposals are just excellent. I've been really excited about those. I think that you've done a tremendous job with those. So I want to talk about some of the challenges in assessing safety culture and connect those to basically the overall challenges in trying to address and regulate safety culture itself. I start with two questions. Emma's already pointed them out, that they were in the OIR report that the Commission had developed. Questions about how to provide greater opportunity for collaboration and what mechanisms can be used to that ensure, let's see if I can get rid of this thing here, that can ensure effective relationships through coordination and collaboration. So that is important. obviously. And so why am I not? Let's see here. Now I'm trying to figure out why I cannot advance to the next process here. Oh, here we go. It was already shown to you the argument I made about a collaborative safety culture assessment process. There's two items here I want to stress. One is there's something special about safety culture as a concept that is different from the concepts and the operational personifications of the other types of regulation that have been done in the past. Safety culture assessment and safety culture regulation is a very different process. And it is a process that has to be a process of research and development and ongoing learning, because nobody knows how to do this yet effectively, even the ones that have tried. So it has to be a cooperative process, continuous learning, and it has to be a collaborative process to have a chance to work. There are many effective, relatively speaking, collaborative safety culture regulators in this country, the NRC, the FAA, Federal Railroad Authority, and in Europe, a whole bunch of these European ones. They all have, as they've tried to do this, come to similar recognitions and have similar elements in their efforts to address safety culture. One is they all have come to recognize that safety culture is a more abstract concept with more indirect connections to accidents and safety outcomes than the other more specific factors and attributes that they've tried to regulate. There are ambiguities in defining and understanding the concept of safety culture that have led to acceptance of different understandings and approaches to safety culture across organizations. Organizations, the ones that are being attempted to promote safety culture, will have different understandings of what it means and will have different approaches to what it means. Actually, it's very interesting that the Norwegian Petroleum Safety Authority tried to implement safety culture. They did it only by a series of guidance documents and recommendations that they never had any control over. They never enforced in any way. And people have looked and said that was really a failure. But other people have looked at that approach and said, no, what they did was they opened up the impression in management in those regulated organizations that there were dimensions and there was space for them to operate in ways they hadn't actually imagined before. And so they began to think about all the neglected areas of management, safety management that they had. And so in that respect, that was a really powerful impact that the Canadian Petroleum Authority actually had. So that has to be recognized, that people will take different approaches. Prescriptive rules and regulatory approaches have been shifted in these organizations in the direction of performance, or what they sometimes term purpose-based approaches, applied to the area of safety culture development and assessment. They cannot go far with a prescriptive, rule-oriented approach to regulation that may have been what they practiced in the past. Regulatory efforts have frequently taken the form of advisory safety culture guidelines that have been issued. The NRC has had guidelines on this assessment process, and so have others, rather than specific rules for both the development and assessment of safety culture. Many regulators, as I said, particularly the PRA in Norway, PSA rather, do not actually apply enforcements to these guidelines and have not applied enforcements. So what does this advisory model, it's been called that, of collaboration actually look like? Again, safety culture is recognized to be abstract and ambiguous and informal, meaning that it can't be formally specified, defined, and described relative to other more physically based prescriptive standards applied under a command and control type of regulation. Regulatory agencies that have tried to address safety culture have tended to adopt this model for their regulation. Here they provide companies with examples and guidance on how to develop strategies within more generally formulated principles or functions. The advisory function of regulation highlights that regulation is a relation between regulators and industry, where the aim is to detect weak signals of danger and solve problems without having to invoke serious sanctions like fines, prosecutions, or banning companies from conducting activities. This is a very different approach that many people are used to in the regulatory process. They've taken a whole bunch of initiatives in this. One is that new rules have been tried. These new rules involve, for example, giving authority to people to stop work if they believe that they are in an unsafe condition, or if the work itself will be unsafe. Another is to create corrective action programs in which anybody can submit a correction action request. And some of the rules require they be acted upon, they be at least acknowledged within 24 hours. The idea of these new rules is to get, we have this model that people think and then they act. Well, there's another psychological model that says, well, if they act, then they'll pretty well come around to thinking. And so if you get people to think differently, to act differently about assuming responsibilities for stopping work when it's unsafe, or taking initiatives to address things that need corrective action, they will start to accept those responsibilities and think differently about their role with respect to them. Safety culture audits, new schemes have been attempted. Interventions, of course, accident investigations. Guidelines for self-assessment have been issued by many of these organizations. At the end of this, I have a whole page on, if you're interested in guidelines that have been proposed by US and international regulators, you can look up what they are. Checklists for safety culture, review with companies of safety performance indicators as part of the search for improvement. And actually this idea of collaboration for improvement, Emma mentioned the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. I did some work for them years ago. Their idea was very interesting. They would get a request from a plant, a nuclear plant, to implement some change. And they might look at it and they might say, we're not sure that this change is going to do what you say it will. We'll work with you on it and we'll make it better. That collaboration idea, where they're actually researching an issue together, was very much the part of the way the CN, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, worked. Advice to company on assessment strategy and safety improvements. Training programs. Actually, some of the regulators actually have training programs for the staff of the regulated utilities. Here's an interesting one. Different forms of communication, including special websites that allow people to communicate within their organization and between the regulator and the organization. Sponsored workshops, which of course the PUC has done, events, confidential reporting systems that have been set up so people can issue requests for consideration of changes in various things that have been done and that are being done, in corrective actions. Even funding for support from research from some regulatory agencies, pilot studies and experimental programs. Actually, the U.S. Federal Railroad Administration set up a participatory rules revision program. They found there were all kinds of rules in the nuclear industry that the railroad industry that railroads were following, and that maybe there were too many. And so they developed this pilot program to involve all kinds of people on the operations side, maintenance side, in reviewing all of the rules to see if they could be simplified or errors in them could be corrected. So people have tried various things. I don't want to go through all of these. The Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement has done similar things. Other agencies, one of the interesting ones that was developed was a safety culture observations process. The Belgian Technical Safety Organization, it's a nuclear regulatory unit, developed this. The idea is you feed this model of safety culture observations by observations provided by inspectors or safety analysts during any contact with the licensee, whether it's inspections, meetings, phone calls, conversations. These observations are recorded with an observation sheet aimed at describing factual and contextual issues surrounding them. And the observations are then linked to assessment processes that are taking place. So that's an interesting development as well. Another question, should the commission designate one specific entity with expertise in safety culture to conduct the independent safety culture assessments required by law? Should the entity be a single public entity that is independent of the commission? I think this is a very interesting question to deal with. Some regulators, such as the NRC, allow the licensee to select their own members of a safety culture assessment team under the guidance of documents from the NRC. And these guidelines allow team to include experts from other nuclear plants or an outside consultant. The NRC inspectors, however, based on their observations, as I mentioned earlier, they can also contribute those observations to the team that's working on the assessment. Few regulators are going to accept simply a single safety culture assessment done entirely by an independent private consultant. But the NRC does weigh, alongside a plant's own assessment, an independent assessment offered by the Institute for Nuclear Power Operators, INPO, which is recognized as a highly expert organization by the nuclear industry. So at times they will have outside experts weigh in on the assessment process. I'm just wondering whether, the CPUC could also use an organization like the Center for Chemical Process Safety to do some assessments and add that information to the information that may come from a self-assessment by one of the utilities. I don't want to really get into this. I just suggested it last time that the California Council for Science and Technology has a lot of experts, and it has independent and expert standing. It doesn't have a lot of social scientists, although there is one member who knows a lot about safety management. And they would have to create a new unit of social science experts, but they possibly could be incentivized to do that word. If the safety culture assessments were to be done by utility completely independent from the PUC, one thing to consider is the PUC might lose an opportunity to develop its own expertise on safety culture and a chance to work cooperatively with its licensees. I believe the CPUC should consider using an assessment process, even if independently conducted by a utility, as an occasion to further develop its own inspection force and their training in the area of safety management and culture. They could follow the safety culture observation strategy that is being developed by the Belgians. Finally, what framework mechanisms could be implemented to ensure that safety assessments are focused on actual safety improvement on the ground results within the industry? Well, I have to offer to begin with a cautionary tale. Beware of the use of accident investigations as a primary process for safety culture assessment and regulatory action. This has, I know in the past, these inspections have led to some regulatory changes. They have been, in a sense, an assessment, if not an indictment, of the safety culture of several organizations. But that needs to be used with some caution. And the arguments I'm going to make now are not mine. They are made by Barry, what's his last name? Sorry, Straunch, who is a member of the National Transportation Safety Board and has participated in a lot of accident investigations. His view is basically an investigation has to come up with a definitive conclusion regarding the cause of an event in a limited time frame. They're focused on single, often unique events, not generalizations covering an ongoing set of behaviors over many operations, which is what a safety culture assessment is interested in. In a search for a logical train of events leading to an accident, investigations often seek out specific causes, error, that leads them to identify individual failures in actions, inactions, or specific decisions.
How to feed the cone.
Pardon? What was that? System factors are harder to identify and measure and thus tend to be neglected in accident investigations. Abstract concepts and indirect causes are rarely addressed in accident investigations. So I could add further just the process of connecting elements of safety culture or their absence with outcomes requires larger numbers of measures across many cases and takes some time, not just individual accidents and reports. The major safety focus on accidents and the safety culture assessment process can undermine a cooperative approach to safety culture assessment and improvement. Instead, a process of finding leading indicators and measures for many behaviors and their outcomes is why safety culture assessment needs to be a cooperative and collaborative research and development process, not a retrospective compliance and punishment focus process. Very quickly, my conclusion is, if there is a conclusion about collaboration, the changing role for regulators in assessing safety culture is the general challenge of regulating for safety culture. which is, as a challenge, to find the appropriate strategies to motivate companies to engage in self-development processes for safety culture and to help them along the way without giving direct instructions. It's even been argued that a basic element of this process is to somehow institutionalize in the organizations being regulated joint discussions and risk assessments of workplace hazards among managers and employees, so that understanding the risks they're trying to avoid leads them to identify a set of precursor conditions, which will then be looked at as leading indicators in the safety assessment and safety culture process. But it also needs to be recognized that successful safety culture assessment and development will also require more research and experience in. Let me just say, we're not there yet. Even the best regulators are not there yet. We need to do more research and gain more experience in how regulators best can motivate companies to start such a process. How do you actually motivate them to do it? How regulators best can facilitate such processes once they have begun. And lastly, what can we learn through their actions about how different means of regulatory facilitation produce different safety culture results? Finally, as I've tried to stress, this is a research and development process. The regulatory process will also have to be a research and development process, and quite clearly, it will have to be a collaborative process. Thank you. Is there anyone there? Hello?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Could you hear me?
Yes, we could hear you. Thank you so
Okay.
much for your presentation.
Thanks.
So we're gonna pause for some time for questions. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, but so if you're a member of the audience, you can raise your hand if you have questions. First, however, I'm going to pass it to Commissioner Hauk and Director Thomas Jacobs to see if they have any questions that they wanted to ask about the first two presentations.
I'll defer to Commissioner first if you've got any questions.
So I guess is that, as you said, this is sort of an evolving process. It's that the regulator and the regulated are sort of working together to move through this. What do you see as the most difficult barriers from going to the current regulatory process that we have to transitioning or moving to a more collaborative approach, particularly for regulated utilities in the energy area?
Well, I see several, and one of them I have to start with, even though I feel I'm trespassing on toes here, is the political environment in which regulators have to operate. I have in the past stated that I think, for example, that the Public Utility Commission tries mightily and heroically to regulate for safety culture in what is a very difficult, let's just say, political environment. When people expect the regulator to have an adversarial relationship with the regulatee and are deeply suspicious of collaborative processes between them, and where people in the legislature decide to write regulatory prescriptions as legislators and impose them, that makes it difficult. And so I guess you know better than I do the constraints of that environment that you have to operate in. And I'm hoping that you will be able to leverage yourself some independence in order to actually have collaborative arrangements and to operate with less than basically sticks and clubs, and more of this understanding, and convey that to legislators and the public. This is not settled knowledge here. There are not correct answers. And when things happen, part of it is we don't know exactly how to regulate a process we know safety culture is important. We don't know exactly how to regulate it effectively. We're having to learn and take steps to do the learning. That's not something that legislators feel good about, and the public may not feel good about. But I guess what I'm saying is part of this will be you'll have to educate the public in order to give yourself the slack and the space to operate this way. And I don't know what, I think that's a major obstacle. And I wish I could be, oh, well, you can do this, this, and this. But I will say this, there are people who have studied this who would be certainly willing to weigh in on your behalf in terms of giving you the slack to actually regulate this way in pursuit of effective safety culture regulation.
No, thank you for that. And one additional question, and then I'll pass it to Director Jacob Thomas. Do you see, the way the Public Utilities Commissions work with our adjudicatory processes and how we function? There's room, obviously, for settlement discussions among parties, but the primary mechanism we use is an adjudicatory process. Do you see that as sort of reinforcing some of these barriers that you were talking about, or do you see that as a way to focus, to be able to build in some more collaborative processes, whether it's through that settlement process or neutrals? But the procedures we use also I think create the atmosphere of what kind of relationships we do and don't have. And your thoughts on that would be appreciated.
I agree, and I can answer that with an illustration. A number of years ago, I and a colleague from Berkeley were asked to come and look over the safety management system within the PUC. And we interviewed people all over, and I went to, one of the interviews was Michael Picker, who was president of the commission then. And he starts out by saying, we have this process, we're doing an investigation. I can't even talk to members of my own damn staff. I'm not allowed to because I've got this judicial role. I'm not supposed, and it does create some real barriers to commissioners having informal discussions without having to note down that they're having these meetings and they're having these discussions. And there was a thing done. The governor years ago, Jerry Brown appointed this guy to do a look at modernization of the PUC. And one of the things he wrote was this law that required these separations had made it very difficult for people to talk and actually communicate with each other within the commission without having to call a public hearing and have people come down. And when we interviewed people, inspectors, I asked them, so you've seen what's going on in this particular utility. Do you share that? Can you give that information when it's relevant to an OIR or something? No, we're not allowed. The people who do the enforcement do not make the laws. We cannot influence the process. And so they had this idea that they couldn't, and that no one wanted to listen to them, in fact, about what they'd seen in the utility. So I think, yes, I have to say that there's a lot of procedure. You might be able to do a participatory procedure revision process where people get to talk about those. But I do think they have been a real problem.
Thank you, and I'll pass to Director Thomas.
Thank you, Commissioner. And Paul, thank you so much for the presentation. Got to hear you at the kickoff meeting as well. So always appreciate your insights. I was wondering, and this blends a little bit with Emma's presentation in terms of what the staff are proposing too, but could you speak a little bit about, in your research, where the sharing of information and the confidentiality protections, the importance of that, or any lessons learned you've come across in your research around that piece of it?
Well, there's one difference to note as background. The organizations that I've been looking at that are interested in safety regulation, they don't have to set rates. So proprietary information that a company may have, which it doesn't want to share with respect to its costs and other things, is not something that they have to deal with. I think there is always the worry that some information that they have that's of a proprietary nature might be leaked. But I think maybe it's the more you do, the better it should go. The more people do interact and begin to trust one another. One of the things we've seen is people across organizations have all said, I need to know the person I'm dealing with when I talk to somebody in another organization. I want to have met them. I want to know something about them. I don't want to talk to a stranger. And so many, we've been looking at a project in Oregon and Washington on emergency response. They introduce people to all of the different agencies and the different utilities. They have monthly meetings where they meet one another, they renew acquaintances so that people are a little more willing to talk because they know who they're talking to and they've met them and they basically trust them. So it's not an easy process. I understand there could be these kind of conflicts. But I think, being able to trust people helps a lot in the willingness to share information, especially information that's doesn't deal with their bottom line of what their earnings are and where their investments lie and things like that.
So that's really interesting, and definitely couldn't agree with you more that the relationship building aspect really is a critical component. And then you made a comment, I think to the commissioner, but I think I'll follow up with you offline to take you up on it in terms of the some researchers that are folks that are doing research on what I often call changing the narrative around how we communicate our role in driving safety, to your point on some of the politics around it. So anyway, so I'll definitely follow up online because I do think that is a critical component, because we want to make sure that this goes back to my sort of opening comments, the larger effort that we're all pulling in the same direction or pushing in the same direction to improve those safety outcomes, and some of the maybe legacy processes are not necessarily pulling in that same direction. So I appreciate your thoughts and answering my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If there are no additional questions from Commissioner Houck or Director Thomas Jacobs, I will pass it to the audience for questions. So if you have questions, you can use the raise hand function or you can type your questions into the chat. Tom, I see that you have your hand raised. So you can
Yes.
you can come off. Yep, perfect.
All right, thank you. Dr. Schulman, I noticed that you mentioned IMPO was credible and you offered some alternatives to an IMPO-like mechanism in California. I'm curious your thoughts of an industry-based organization similar to IMPO, given its credibility.
Okay, well, the Center for Chemical Process Safety is kind of an industry organization, and it has a lot of respect. There is the railroad, the Canadian Railroad Association, which is an association of different railroads companies that seems to be very prominently mentioned as a source of real information and expertise. So that would be certainly in Canada. Let's see, what else do we have? Not sure what approaches their levels, but there certainly are various industries that are quite interested in regulatory standards, in actually standards themselves. I guess the ISO is an organization that's standards lobby group that people have a lot of respect for. So that would be not necessarily just in California, obviously, but that would be another organization. I think they're out there, and probably some of the people in the utilities could tell you themselves which ones in their industry they think very highly of.
Okay, so like something that's directly relevant or knowledgeable about gas and electric.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's who you would want, that is known for being a real, they do set standards for the industry, or try to.
Right.
I think that would be an organization that would be useful to talk to.
Right. Thank you.
If other people have questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand or type them into the chat.
I see a hand.
That's me, Ken. Hi, Paul.
Oh, hi, Ken. How are you?
Great. I'm just sitting here thinking, though, I wanted to follow up or piggyback on to Caroline's question about the confidentiality issue. We've been talking about this a lot within the staff. There's this balance between confidentiality and sharing. They're kind of oxymoron type words. But in looking at what other entities are doing, other organizations who oversee utility operations, they think the confidentiality issue is very important to a successful safety culture. And also, on the other hand, the ability to collaborate and share to some point. One theme we saw was the entity, the organization owns its safety culture, does its assessment either by a third-party vendor or someone inside. They use the results, they own it, they take it, they grow with it, they learn from it, whatever. But the part that they share, if there's that word, with the regulatory agency is pretty much just a high-level overview. It's something that would say, we're doing this, lessons learned, this is how we're making improvements. But the idea of confidentiality is pretty high on their list for successful safety culture. I know you answered the question, but I just thought if there's any deeper insight you might have into that.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering what is the cost to them of having the confidential information revealed? Is it confidential because they're involved in some judicial or legal thing and their lawyer told them don't say anything publicly? Is it confidential because they don't want competitors to know the information? Is it confidential because they're afraid of actions that will be taken by regulators or political organizations if it's revealed? What do you think are the major reasons for their worry about losing confidential information?
One of the ones I heard the most, I think, was the last item, which was fear of some sort of punitive or enforcement action, particularly if it's something that they find themselves kind of a self-report, but they keep the information to themselves. Maybe change it, because we as a regulator don't want to be put in a position of, oh, we're going to be your regulatory friend and we're going to be a safety partner. And if we find some violation that you're doing, we as the regulator, well, we're just not going to report it. We're not going to do anything about it. We really can't do that in my mind. So we have to have this balance of being a regulator to the extent that that's what we do versus trying to be a safety partner, collaborator on the other hand.
Well, one thing you could try, which I'm not sure you'd be comfortable with exactly either, but when they wanted information from pilots, not pilots, but air traffic controllers about losses of separation they may have been involved in, they knew that they wouldn't report it because if you're a controller and you preside over 3 losses of separation, that's the end of your career. And so the FAA said, okay, here's the thing. If you have a loss of separation event, we're going to hire NASA to collect this information, and it's not going to be by your name. You can do it anonymously to them. And as long as you've reported it, if it ever comes back and we find out that it happened for you, because you reported it, it's not going to count as one of the three. So, they sort of said, we're going to give you kind of immunity because you're telling us voluntarily. And so we will not fine, punish, prosecute, whatever it is, if you tell us voluntarily what's happening. And one thing they found out was there was a hell of a lot more of separations, losses of separation than they realized were going on. And they learned a lot about the reliability of the air traffic control system. So, I don't know whether you could do anything like this in the PUC, but if they come to you and they tell you, then you say, well, okay, that's important for us to know. It helps us to know that kind of thing is happening. And we will not prosecute you because of it. I don't know whether that's even possible.
And we've been looking at the whole, close call near miss thing that FAA and NASA does for a long time. It's really amazing. It's worked very well. What we didn't know until maybe, at least what I didn't know until last week, is that they have actually a congressional protection where there's now statute that says no reprisals on these close call near miss reports.
Oh, that's interesting.
Our thought, to take an entity that a NASA substitute, if you will, would be maybe some academic institution or some trusted third party, to be this receiver for the near miss close calls.
Yeah, I'm hard put at the moment to imagine an academic organization that people would have enough confidence in to think that they wouldn't reveal the information one way or another. But there must be, there might be those kind of organizations that would, be more trusted. I would hope eventually the PUC would be trusted.
Yeah, me too. But back to my original question, though, the level of confidentiality within a safety culture, it is kind of counterintuitive if you want to have openness and discussion and collaboration, to have something that's confidential. So there's this yin and yang part of it that I can see both issues very clearly myself. And is there, if there's some balance, or do you know of anybody that might have experienced this, to what level, how they're addressing it? But it seems like the organizations we talk to who do this, they just take a hands-off approach. We don't want to know what you're doing. We do want to know that you're developing your own safety culture, that you have some guidelines, you're meeting, you're talking within yourselves. We, the regulator, will come and talk to you, periodically. You'll share things with us.
Right.
But we don't want to get into the weeds and the deep dive.
I think
that you're doing it.
But I think if you could get away from a lot of the adversarial overlay onto the utility and regulator, that would help. I mean, one of the things that was amazing to me was this locate and mark scandal at PG&E. I'm sure you're aware of that, where the legislature, in its wisdom, decided to write a regulation about the locate and mark process and gave the utility 48 hours to respond to any request from a contractor about the location of lines and pipelines, to a contractor that sent in some information about their plans to dig. And it turned out that they had thousands of these requests. I think I saw something, they had 5,000 requests for locate and mark information and clearances in a week. They were swamped. And you'd think, okay, well, for heaven's sakes, tell the PUC you can't do this. They didn't. And in fact, they falsified clearances in order to just deal with the, we can't be seen as taking more than 48 hours. So let's just write a clearance for this and tend to it later. And so if they had a different relationship with the PUC, where they could have said, look at this, we just can't do this. We don't have the staff. We don't have the people. You've got to do something. You've got to help us. That would have been a much better route than actually putting pressure on people in their own organization to falsify clearance reports.
So interesting you brought that up. I mentioned in my comments that we have an underground infrastructure directorate too that is related to safety. It is the Underground Safety Excavation Board, so that does the locate and mark regulation. So interesting comment that that you've made. And I know that it's over time been being sort of looked at through the board. But good.
I talked to Tony Marino, who I guess is a staff person on the DIG.
Yeah, he's on my team. That infrastructure board, or that oversight board, moved over to Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety as of January.
Yeah. Well, I'm taking it maybe beyond where you want to go, but Tony and I talked about this issue about trying to have a safety culture that actually overlaps both the utilities and the contractors and the dig board. They eventually would trust one another and could share information with one another about what's happening, and that might be helpful to actually upgrade the safety of that whole dig-in process. It's not easy to do something like that, though.
I just wanted to point out that, oh, Carolina, I'll let you go. I was going to point out your chat comments and Dr. Cooper's comments, but you can go ahead.
Thank you, Emma. So, Dr. Schulman, I had a question for you, and I think this is a really interesting conversation. So it sounds to me that a lot of this suggestion of building trust is the intent is so that there is a flow of communication from the different members of the culture or parties involved in these decisions. Now, how could the CPUC resolve the area where in building trust, there's information that maybe isn't regulated, but that may look bad in a utility. And maybe that's the reason a utility doesn't want to share it, because it will, maybe it will become public and it's a PR issue, or it looks negatively on them, even though it may not be a violation of any codes or anything of the like. Do you have any suggestions in that regard?
Well, I mean, it might be worthwhile to actually try to formalize a little bit of this issue of confidentiality and say, so here are the things that we need to know about that are relevant to our interest in safety culture and how it's working, incidents of some sort. But here are the things we don't care about. Or if you want to talk about, you can do it in a hypothetical way, or don't have any names attached or dates or whatever it is. Just, but in a sense, you hope that the utility itself begins to realize what's important from the standpoint of managing a safety culture and the effectiveness of it, that they would think that that's important and that they might share it. And they would feel also, this has nothing to do, this is an individual who has personal problems. There's no reason to share that in connection with the safety culture process, and maybe you could arrive at some clarification about what is and what isn't necessary to share. And if it's not necessary to share, I mean, now you could say, well, they would decide it's not necessary because they don't want to share it. But I mean, if you could have in advance the kinds of things that are clearly not necessary for the utility, for the regulator to know, maybe that would, not be such a problem.
Thank you.
By the way, just one additional thing. This is one of these things that could well be the subject of very useful conversations between the PUC and people in the utilities. Let's see if we can figure out this problem of confidentiality and try to isolate out and define what are the areas where we really need the information. It is critical for the regulatory and the safety process, as opposed to the things that we don't need to really pursue. We don't have to have information about it.
Dr. Schulman, sorry, and I just wanted to follow up. So do you see any need for the CPUC in working a collaborative relationship for the utility to be able to bring up issues that they have maybe internally with their own safety culture, so that the regulator can help them troubleshoot or can
Absolutely
provide support? So I guess that's where, so those issues may not be, we would need to know about them in order to.
Yes, that's an area where it would be, right? If you say, we're having a problem with people actually reporting incidents. We know they're happening, but nobody's reporting them. That is something that absolutely, you know, and if they should feel maybe comfortable saying, we're going to try this. What do you think? What have you learned about the, you know, having this issue of non-reporting going on? What are we not having the right incentives? What other organizations can do that? If they thought that the PUC actually was a clearinghouse for information about what other regulators are doing, if then they've encountered something like that, they might be willing to have a conversation about it. And, you know, that issue, obviously, we're having some non-compliance issues. You know, I'm sure a newspaper would love to have that information, would make a big story out of it if they could. But if, you know, you just say the only information we need about it is, you know, how many have there been and what unit is there and what have you tried? Maybe that would somehow be less threatening a revelation.
Thank you, Dr. Schulman. I wanted to point out some chat comments we got from Dr. Cooper and Carolina about the American Petroleum Institute and National Safety Council. So those were recommended as potential third parties.
Absolutely.
I know,
Yep.
yeah, I know people on the phone cannot see the chat. And I'm going to do one more pause for people to raise their hand if they have questions, and then we can go to our break a little early if not.
I thought I saw a hand under Carolina Contreras. Did we get her?
I think she just lowered it. She asked her question.
Okay.
Okay. So if there are no additional questions, we can go to our break until 2:30, and I will see everyone back here in about 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We'll give people a few more minutes to rejoin after the break and see if I can see other people are here. Make sure I'm not talking to myself.
This is
We
Caroline.
can hear you.
Thanks, everyone. Awesome. I like the thumbs up. Okay. So our first presentation after the break, or actually our last presentation of the day, is going to be a joint utility presentation from PG&E, SCE, SDG&E, and SoCalGas. So I'm going to pass it over to Tom, Melvin, Jim, and Gary, and I can advance your slides for you. So just let me know when you want to go to the next slide, please.
Thank you, and we're ready to start. The next one, please. We'll jump right into the two questions that were posed to us. And I'll just say at the outset that our proposal or our answers are very much in alignment with the proposal that you offered earlier. So they should read almost as a duplicate in a way. So for the first question, how can the Commission develop an approach for improving safety culture that provides an opportunity for collaboration? Our response is develop a framework that cultivates trust and transparency so that we understand existing safety cultures, the evolving world of safety cultures, and understand the current barriers to cultivating an atmosphere of collaboration over time. We see that there's a way to leverage proven successes of collaboration, as both of you mentioned, actually, and that we can identify and learn from failures and shortcomings of these collaborations as we're all learning, as was mentioned earlier. And then, of course, we agree that a dynamic of positive participation is critical. And as mentioned earlier as well, there is no one size fits all. We're all trying to figure it out. And then I will just keep going unless there are questions, or I guess maybe at the end as well. So the next slide, please. So what mechanisms can be used in such implementation that ensure accountability through coordination and collaboration, as opposed to a protectionist model? We'll establish a common mission, objectives, definitions, indicators, and define what will be measured and how, and set the expectations out early and collaboratively. Set up a structure that includes ongoing facilitated working groups. From your slide, actually, your final slide, slide 11, to promote learning, sharing, and networking to engender trust. Have credible, purpose-driven leadership involved on all sides. Build trust to avoid a punitive approach, and of course, create a learning mindset. And this allows for flexibility in decision-making among all parties as they pursue a path to improve safety performance and the culture that results from that. And then also you mentioned this in your proposal to incorporate formal and informal collaboration with others, which we thought was nicely listed in your last slide. So other associations, safety culture experts, and other regulators. So we now have 4 regulatory models to look at. I'll be doing the first, which is IMPO, and then we'll move to NRC, FAA, and Canada. So on the first one on IMPO, the next slide, please. IMPO is very interesting, and it speaks to, I think, the issues that were brought up in the last half hour of our conversation, in that it's not actually a regulator. It's an industry organization that was formed after a 3-mile island, and it sits on the side, if you will, of the relationship between the NRC and the power plants, the nuclear power plants. And so it plays a buffer role for expertise, as well as for holding confidential information. And it enjoys great respect from both the NRC, as we heard earlier, and the utilities themselves. It was a purpose-built organization, initially led by a Navy admiral with great nuclear expertise, and for that reason got off to a great start in terms of respect on both sides. One thing that they did do was lead with this traits of a healthy nuclear safety culture, and it by design aligns with the NRC terminology, and it provides a framework for open discussion and continued evolution. So what's critical is it doesn't prescribe a specific program or an implementation method. It's not a checklist. They're provided for use in self-assessments, root cause analysis, and to help with the design of training programs. The traits are considered representative and not comprehensive. Next slide, please. These are the traits. They should look very familiar to many of us. They're commitments that occur both from an individual and from management. And it also speaks to the criticality of a systematic approach in the 4 areas that are listed. I won't read these. We'll just go to the next slide. So INPO is quite comprehensive. And the idea is that if these 6 areas are looked at carefully and best practices followed, a culture is a result of working through these processes. Of course, a culture is a byproduct. And they look at these 6 areas: evaluations, training, event analysis, emergency preparedness, general assistance, and new plant deployment. And what they do is anonymous, reciprocal peer assessments, which tend to organically drive improvements within each plant. There's a little bit of competition and a reputation and a desire to improve. That is the psychological phenomenon that's actually played out over time. And so these evaluation teams, which I think is strength, is that they come from peer utilities, look at these 5 areas: knowledge and performance of plant personnel, conditions of systems and equipment, quality of programs, effectiveness of plant management, and corporate evaluations. So we looked at 4 different models. This one is different in that INPO is not a regulator, and it provides intriguing possibilities of a way to think about a purpose-built organization as opposed to perhaps looking for some other third party that can win the respect and earn the respect of both the PUC and the utilities and contractors. And with that, I'll turn it over to Gary to talk about the NRC itself.
Hey, thanks a lot, Tom. I appreciate that. Let's go ahead and get started. This is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that we're going to be covering. So from this point out, it will be the NRC as we discuss. Thanks, Emma. To the next slide. So this process was really kind of expanded back in 2008, and it was a focus of the safety culture policy that really helped all of its nuclear regulatory entities. So it was very broad. The NRC really took on a collaborative effort with its stakeholders. The purpose was really to kind of build in some definitions on the safety culture itself. They did so through a list of different traits that help describe positively these safety cultures. This process, being extensive across the country, went from 2008 to 2011, where they established the safety culture policy statement, which was one of the core documents that they had, along with a variety of other tools to help facilitate an understanding of the importance of that positive safety culture that we're really looking for. The NRC, it continued to provide a series of outreaches through educations on the importance of the positive safety culture through presentations at various conferences or trade, through all the different mechanisms where they were able to build workshops and have open discussions with their stakeholders to really drive and help solidify that positive safety culture. Could you advance to the next slide, please? So the NRC engaged in these efforts to collaborate with the board on a broad range of stakeholders and leaders in the nuclear industry. They also had a variety of other organizations, members, publics that were interested in that safety culture. And so through these workshops, through the presentations that the commission itself provided to its stakeholders, they were able to help elevate the public comments that enabled interested parties to kind of weigh in on the drafts of this safety culture policy statement as it began to develop and flesh out. They worked with the stakeholders, with the public, with those individuals who were invested in this process to really hone a definition of what the safety culture and high-level set of traits would eventually look like. And their end result ended providing a series of 9 different traits that were able to help them communicate effectively what that safety culture would look like as part of the tools that they relied upon. The NRC staff also participated in panels. They made different presentations at all of these different industry forums to really engage their stakeholders in order to build it as a collaborative effort and not just a top-down or a bottom-up. So through the development of that process, they were able to obtain additional inputs that continually helped evolve that process. And the definitions and traits eventually were developed, and they were able to be shared with the broader stakeholder group. NRC staff collaborated with IMPO to help support that consistency and alignment in the approach that Tom had talked about earlier in his presentation. Next slide, please, Emma. These were some of the best practices that we thought were important to highlight as some of the results through the years-long efforts that were taken by NRC. Excuse me. These will include the safety culture policy statement, which was core, as well as the safety cultural case studies, the safety culture trait talks that we had mentioned before, the ongoing stakeholder outreach and collaboration and education, which was key, that it wasn't just a one-time, but it was a continuing process, and the process evolved through the years. The regulatory commitments to safety and the maintenance of outreach materials and educational resources that were provided to their stakeholders. And these were some of the things that allowed for NRC through their efforts to really collaborate and build that strong safety culture and the safety culture policy statement that they have today. Thank you very much.
Okay, this is Jim Turman with SDG&E. I'm going to talk briefly about the FAA model, if you will, and if you can advance this, Emma. Thank you. And this does kind of just display a brochure that the FAA published related to their culture and positive safety culture, as you can see. And some of the, on the left side, are really some of the key takeaways that we drew from reading through this and kind of looking at how some of the other models that express similar ideas. So you can see, I don't need to read all the bullets, but you can see that and we've already talked about a lot of this. I know earlier we discussed the FAA model, so I don't need to repeat all this, but it does have to do with setting the mission and setting the expectations. And collaboration, of course, is kind of our core, one of our core themes here. We have to have not only the regulatory commitment to safety excellence, but the companies have to be committed to that, of course. And we have to make sure that that starts with our personnel. You know, I mean, I think safety culture is, and hopefully I get agreement on this, it is really, it starts with people and how they view what they need to do each day, and trying to move the needle with employee safety helps advance the culture. and getting people on board. And that includes it's that dynamic of the supervisor to the employees who report to him or her, and that interchange and exchange of information. So it starts in a kind of a smaller world and works its way up to affect the the culture overall in the company. Another bullet here is the non-punitive empowerment and encouragement. So we, the effort or the intent would be to empower employees to report anonymously if that's the opportunity. Preferably it is, especially for things that they may be a little concerned about, but encourage the reporting of, as we talked earlier about reporting injuries, but also reporting the near miss, close call incidents and the stop work types of activities, and feel empowered to make a statement about those without any sort of retribution, and to build on that. And that has to be done in that smaller framework, team by team, department by department, and so on. And I think you all know that, so I don't have to go on about it. But you can see the mission statement in the lower left here from the FAA that is similar to a lot of mission statements, but I think that's something that we would need to be thinking about. What is our mission statement going to be for this initiative we're in today? So Emma, next slide I think is mostly brochure. I think one key takeaway on this slide is, without a note on it, is that you need to have people want to be safe, right? Or think about what it means not to be safe. And so that's the desire for safety. And nobody wants to get hurt, but sometimes people, as we all know, are distracted or not on quite focused or tired or whatever it might be, and things slip away. And anyway, next slide. There, and this is a kind of last set of takeaways. Yes, enforcement can play a role. It probably has to, but it's not always best solution. And the corrective actions are really fundamentally more powerful than punishment typically, and that has to be done in a collaborative way. The corrective actions, I think we heard that earlier on the call about the regulator working with the entity to find a solution on something that was identified, rather than create some punitive environment around it or utilize punishment. And then make sure that you solve your problems by understanding root causes, and that's hard for a big big process like this. But when you do that in smaller areas and you start to understand more about how the root causes are replicated through your organization and how you can root them out, so to speak, and help resolve them. And then the last one is really building trust. Again, we've touched on that. That's kind of a cornerstone of what we talked about today, but the industry partnerships are going to be important to what we're doing. Sharing of information, we've talked about that already. And the data analysis, not sure what form that would take on, but we have had some good suggestions today about how to share, perhaps have a third party such as NSC, National Safety Council, or someone participate in collecting data so that there's a sort of a common storeroom for those things. But the bottom line is build the trust and build the relationships. And again, we've made that, and I think in the Commission's earlier statements and in our cornerstone statements, those are two fundamental elements of what we have to happen, so that we don't have either party feel that there's a violation of that trust. We have to break down those barriers for trust and relationships. So I think that's the last of it here. Emma, if you want to advance. Yep, that was all I had to say. Thank you.
Great. I'll take this next section and the recommendations as well. So my name is Melvin Brown, and I represent Southern California Edison. You can move to the next slide, please, Emma. Thank you. So I'm aware that we have covered to some great extent the Canada Energy Regulator already. So I'll try to stick to some really key points here. The first being, as we think about how we foster collaboration, this clarification around roles is key. Potential vehicle for that being a regulator working group to essentially define how the regulator shows up within city culture across the regulated entities. This notion of clarification of expectations as well is important. Manifested here through the city culture statement released by the CER that really articulated expectations in a way that also defines city culture through the lens of risk-based approach. And lastly, as you've heard throughout our time together today, trust is key, right? So invest in time in outreach, in education, and collaboration efforts. That really highlights the fact that this is in fact a shared journey as we learn together to figure out how best to operate in this space. If we could move to the next slide, please, Anna. Some key notes that I'd like to share in terms of the CER's approach to fostering collaboration. I think this premise of system requirements being counterproductive when thinking about regulating safety culture, I think is important. Focusing instead on systems influence that very much is in alignment with the principles we've been discussing, specifically being that the regulated entity at the end of the day is the owner of its safety culture, right? Is ultimately responsible for its safety culture. This notion of expectations as well, I think, is important. A lot of focus here on learning, sharing, networking. But one of the things that we've mentioned before as well is, what are we trying to accomplish together? So what is our core mission? What are the tenets that defines that? And then how do we form expectations around those core tenets? Having a similar vocabulary so that we are talking apples to apples and when we talk about culture is important. And ensuring that if we progress towards measurement, that we are using a common set of indicators to ensure, again, that our comparisons are identical. As it relates to relationship building, again, I think this is a key pillar for any successful collaboration between regulator and regulated entity. So, one of the things that we want to, hopefully discuss is the extent to which the regulator can actually impact our safety outcomes. And there's probably a need here to be evaluating inwardly as well as outwardly to ensure that, again, we're all on the same page moving together. The extent to which there's also openness to sharing implementation success and failures, which is one of the key pieces that the CER focused on, as well as essentially setting up a center of excellence, if you will, to ensure that the materials supporting safety culture assessments, advances in the research, and the literature around safety culture, organizational behavior, and psychology is widely available and shared amongst regulated entities and or regulator as well. If we could move to the next slide, please, Emma. I think we'll actually skip the outcomes of this. I think you already covered that in the initial presentation. So I'd like to move us to the recommendations that you heard Tom allude to at the top of our presentation. And so, the first one that we'd like to really put forward is it is crucial that we continue outreach and education efforts with the regulated entities and stakeholders as a part of our city culture rulemaking. Very much like to revisit this notion of having an independent third party, similar to the INPO example. I think NSC has been raised as well. To ensure that we are at least beginning from a place of anonymity, to ensure that there's full transparency in our ability to share information without consequences, and kind of looking at the MOA that exists between INPO and NRC that really articulates a strong desire for continuing and cooperative relationship in the exchange of experiences, information, data. So codifying that in a way that creates mutual accountability, but also leaves space for flexibility as we grow into this together. Another key piece that has been raised that we'd like to bring forward is the notion of broader industry engagement. So through industry forums, through other organizations. I think it's key that we continue to learn from where the wheels have been created before refined, and where they're actually driving results. What are the key pieces that we would like to adopt from best practices perspective? Again, the notion of a non-punitive approach is key. We should be very much focused on empowerment and encouragement, not necessarily trying to punish. As we think about the notion of these workshops as well, the extent to which we are leveraging safety culture expertise as it exists to ensure that there is a very clear direction, that our actions are again grounded in the literature and the most advanced research that's available, such that the pillars that we ultimately construct lead to the desired outcomes that I think we're all looking for, which is that we're operating safely from a both public and employee perspective as well. I also want to touch a little bit on, and I think we started this discussion with what Kenneth raised in terms of understanding the challenges to collaborative experiences together, right? So it's very clear that there are still some issues that need to be parsed out, so kind of broken down into its component pieces to understand where do those barriers exist, to what extent are we kind of held within those barriers based on our current model, and is there an opportunity to think outside of the box in a manner that again drives collaboration, drives trust, but ensures that at the end of the day there's still accountability for both sides. So that really kind of wraps up the recommendations that we have developed together. As Tom also mentioned, I do think that there is a lot more similarity between our approaches than differences, but there still lays, I think, an important piece for discussion to really parse through what does this actually mean for how we build this together. And we're looking forward to discussing that with you. I think that's the end of our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Melvin. All right, now we're going to move on to a question and answer session for this particular presentation, and we have until 3:30 for that. So I'm first going to pass it over to Commissioner Hauk to see if she has any questions for the utilities.
Yes, I think the presentations, and I apologize, I saw the last couple and I think I missed the first one. But I think you all talked about a mindset and having, wanting to be safe. And when you're looking at like the nuclear industry, I think people are afraid and don't obviously want to have nuclear accidents, or with airplanes, there's a lot of people, you don't want an airplane crash. So how do you get that mindset or translate it to some of the work that utilities are doing on a broader scale when we're looking at things like transmission maintenance and operations of the transmission lines and the gas lines that where you're working with multiple layers of different individuals and subcontractors to get that, what kind of a shift is needed, or can you talk about some of the things that you're doing to change that mindset and over all those different layers of folks that you're having to work in regards to safety on some of those day-to-day operations?
So I'll take it first for Southern California Edison. So we have been on a journey of safety culture ownership for some time. So our 2017 assessment outlined that we were in a place of public compliance on our safety culture maturity model, wherein folks were willing to make safer choices if there was someone watching them. And the example I used was, the seatbelts going on and we see, the police car in a rear view or slowing down, right? So very much external factors leading to behaviors. And so focus has very much been on intrinsic motivations, right? Protecting ourselves through doing what we love. And that's been a core theme that we've carried through the entirety of our two latest assessments, as well as structuring our roadmap to ensure that there is an understanding of the cognitive factors that lead to the choices that we make as individuals on a day-to-day basis. But at the same time, also understanding that there are very much programmatic pieces that are in place to help us stay safe, right? The catalyst piece here being how do we ensure that on a consistent basis, folks are tapping into, I have agency protecting myself, working on what I value. There are tools, roles, programs that are available for me to leverage to protect myself, and that it really is in my best interest to do so. So that's from the employee perspective. What we have been doing with our contractors as well, recognizing that we're not necessarily, the employers of these employees, but very much wanting to ensure that there is almost cultural synchronicity in how we're operating in our shared work environments. So we have provided our roadmaps to our contractor partners. We've provided workshops to help them understand how to operationalize leader safety development, for example, helping them to essentially establish the cultural principles that drives to the performance that we're looking for. We're not saying you have to do it the way that we did, but there absolutely has to be a focus on culture, not just on the rules and tools to help them get there as well. And I would say that our focus not only extends to our employees or contractors, but to the public as well. And so there's very much a public safety element that is folded into our safety culture roadmaps. And so we are thinking about the consequences of our actions or inactions on the communities that we serve and that we are very much a part of as well.
So piggybacking off of that question.
Well, I'm sorry, Carolyn, I just wanted to hear if the other utilities wanted to respond to that.
I thought Melvin did a wonderful job, actually, describing exactly Tom Coheno, PG&E, in a very similar way. The challenge that we're talking about here is how to incent and motivate utilities. And basically, it's at the top of a chain of motivations that need to occur, where we in PG&E are doing everything that we can think of to drive the sense of agency in the employee population, and supervision first, and then they're trying to drive it within the employees. And you in turn are trying to incent the utility, the broader utility. The phenomenon is almost exactly the same. And as Dr. Schulman mentioned, we're trying to figure it out, and we're trying to figure it out for the supervisors and for the employee, as Melvin mentioned, this creating a sense of agency among the employee population. So we just want to contribute to that string.
And then just really quick, and then I'll turn over to Director Jacob Thomas. And how do you get to a point where the regulator and the regulated are kind of moving together along that avenue where there's trust on the IOU side to make sure the regulator has the information it needs to evaluate how it's regulating and able to create mechanisms that result in safer results as opposed to focusing on punitive measures?
Well, so I gave a little talk on INPO, and I think an INPO-like entity, a purpose-built entity like INPO, acts as a perfect buffer to solve several conundrums, right? So that can, if it's respected, highly respected organization by both the PUC and the utility, then that's a mechanism for treating a whole host of issues.
Okay, go ahead, Director Thomas. I just wanted to make sure that.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. So piggybacking off of that question, because I think it touches on a really important element that we've all been talking about, the regulator and the regulated. But there is this third party in the room, the contractors, who provide a significant amount of really safety critical work in the field, literally on the ground. And so one thing I'd be curious, to hear your thoughts on it now, but also just to sort of tee it up for further thoughts, is that developing this, let's call it reimagined safety culture in and I'm thinking electrical, right? That's not my space as wildfire safety, so electrical, but certainly could be applied across all of the industries that the commission approaches or oversees, is an industry cultural change, which means those contractors that support that industry, even if they're not the directly regulated entity or of course the regulator, that they're also a part of this, right? Because it's the holistic system. It's a reorientation of that intrinsic, and I like that word, of motivation at the individual level from bottom to top across all of the different industry entities, that there has to be that priority of safety, right? Community and worker safety. So anyway, so I would welcome thoughts on that piece of it. And again, also just teeing it up for maybe further discussion and thought throughout this process.
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I think the utilities are scoring contractors and working with contractors extensively. PG&E has a extensive outreach with contractors. My sense is that, and I think this is clear from Patty Poppy, our CEO, is that there are no restrictions on our thinking. There's no covering, right? There is just a pure, unadulterated desire to be as safe as humanly possible for the public and for employees. That's just the way it is. And if someone had the answer to prevent all injuries, it would be priceless, or to the public or to within a company. So in my mind, it's like we're all, I like the way Dr. Schulman put it, let's get together and let's figure it out. I think the contractors are completely bought in. I think the utilities are bought in. I think the commission's bought in. And I, not to come back, but in the one model, I'm sure there's other ways to do it. INPO has served as sort of that focal point for just relentlessly sharing best practices and approaches and driving motivation and a lot of kind of peer. I think there's really something to the peer aspect of that, of getting straight 2020 kind of feedback. So I think they're a part of the mix, no different than the utility itself.
I think from an SE perspective, we have been and continue to look from end-to-end perspective at our relationship with our contractors, from how we select and onboard, the expectations that we set, the observations that we do to ensure that those expectations are in fact being met, the extent to which we respond and the depth of our response when an incident does occur, right? So in-depth root cause analyses to ensure that we're learning from incidents, not just the things that happen within our industry, but from a broader perspective as well, and really creating a culture of learning that extends well beyond the walls of the utility to ensure that, again, the folks working side by side with our employees are holding themselves to the same standard, have the same cultural exposure, understand the intersection of culture and process-based safety, right? So we are committed and have been committed and will continue to be, as Tom alluded to earlier. In terms of the mechanism, I think there's very much an openness to understanding what works best. We recognize that to some extent we're forging new territory here. And so, the extent to which we can continue this dialogue, get into the specifics on what the nature of that relationship looks like, we're very much eager and open to that. But we have been taking, I would say, tremendous steps to improve not only our safety culture, but that of the folks that work for us as well.
Thank you. No additional comments or questions from me.
One
Thank you.
more. Oh, sorry, Emma. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. You go ahead, Commissioner.
Just one more question. So as you're developing the or reevaluating your safety culture, if you found that in the past or that there's been problems or things that haven't been paid attention to, and you're now developing a more positive safety culture, you're finding things that may have been wrong. So in the short term, things look maybe worse than they did before because now you're tracking them. How do you ensure or continue to build that collaborative approach to be able to, raise those issues and get to a point where what may look worse is actually getting better? I know sounds confusing, so I'm trying to think of a clearer way to say it. But if you're improving safety and you weren't paying attention to things in the past, or things weren't being necessarily reported because you didn't have that mindset we're talking about, but you're moving towards it, you want to encourage people to report. So like I said, in the shorter term, it may look like things have actually gotten worse, but if you're correcting and making improvements and building that culture, there should be a point where it's getting better. So in that interim, how do you continue to build that mindset and develop those relationships with the regulator to get to a point where we all, I think, want to be, which is a positive safety culture that's addressing things in a manner that has on the ground results that make the system safer. And I hope that made sense.
You know, the thing that leads to mind for me is this notion of trust. It's my hope that PG&E at least comes across as certainly earnest. Doesn't have all the answers, but we're trying to be utterly honest with ourselves and honest with all stakeholders, that it's a quest that we're pursuing. Right? We're working very closely with the unions as well as a way to create this culture. So if we're honest about the future and we start to examine something that looks worse in the short term, I think we're going to have to trust each other, both parties and all stakeholders, that we're doing everything we can, all of us, to solve whatever the conundrum happens to be, whatever that is revealed. But I think, so the other entities we saw, the examples show that the trust matters. Someone mentioned that the number of close calls in aviation at first were revealed to be a lot greater than they thought. If that phenomenon happens, I would hope that we all have the courage and fortitude to examine that and pursue solutions.
Yeah, and this
Tom.
is Gary Bailey from
Oh.
SoCal Gas, and I just kind of want to echo what Tom was saying. I think you hit upon something that was key, and that is, if we're moving the culture of safety, then we're more than likely going to be discovering more incidents in the short term, because we're trying to create a group within our own IOUs and our contractors in order to get psychological safety, a place where people can openly share these things that will be problematic, so that we can discover patterns, trends, in order to address those. And unless we create a holistic culture where we've developed that psychological safety, we won't actually resolve the problem. We'll still have skeletons. And so those are some of the focuses that we're trying to do, is to ensure that this cultural shift gives people the safety to be able to bring out some of those issues that they found to be problematic, so that we can really get down to the root cause.
This is Melvin, just again from SCE. I think at its core, when you think about building a more resilient organization, right, I go to human organizational principles, right? First of all, we're fallible as human beings, period. There is absolutely hazards embedded in the system, but the extent to which we're able to, I think, comprehensively, from a risk-based approach, identify those hazards, build in appropriate mitigations, have the right corrective actions in place to ensure that we are learning from our incidents. Leading indicators like close calls are actually welcomed, because it is an opportunity to learn. Similar to what was just raised as well, we are very much focused on psychological safety. In fact, we define it as speaking up. And it's something that we are helping our leaders to understand, that as we continue on our safety culture maturity journey, it is something to be celebrated, recognized. The extent to which we're able to learn really is congruent with the extent to which we're able to build a more resilient culture. So even though there's an overarching cultural approach, they're very much kind of key, I would say, human performance principles that we are folding into our culture. Started at first with training to ensure that our folks are looking at risk in the same way, right? And that they're viewing leading indicators like close calls, like conducting safety observations, as positives, as things from which we learn, as opposed to things that we hide or that we try to keep away. And I will also say that we've been on this journey for quite some time. We're gradually progressing towards a more just culture, if you will, where we can truly facilitate, again, a more resilient system.
No, thank you, everyone. And I really appreciated the presentations and the input and just how important it is that we are having these discussions and that we continue to expand the discussions. And so I'll turn it back over to Emma.
Thank you, Commissioner Houck. Now we can move to participant questions. So if people have any questions that they want to ask to the utilities or to other people that have spoken today, feel free to raise your hand. Dr. Cooper?
Yeah, hi. I thought that was a very interesting presentation, and I thought there was some interesting, there's kind of a commonality across the 4 IOUs. I think one of the questions I've got, I picked up on what you have, but the missing piece for me was in terms of collaboration at the board, at the executive level across the industry with the regulator, and also how the impact of the design of your structure and systems is impacting on safety culture. And the root of my question is that James' reason showed that 70% of all incidents, process safety incidents and personal injury incidents, arise from senior executive leadership and down through the line management structure. Independent research on loss of process containment and those kind of avenues also show that 80% of all process safety incidents arise from managerial non-compliance. So I'm kind of interested in that space. I hear everything I heard from you was very much about the employees out in the field and the contractors, but from none of you have I heard anything about the collaboration of the boards and the senior management teams and how that plays into the industries and the IOUs safety culture. And I know in the oil and gas industry, I've been part of that for quite some time. There's industry forums, there's a whole lot of sharing. Construction industry is the same as well. It's kind of a norm. And I'm not so sure that's the norm within the IOUs. So I guess, how do we engage the execs and the board members? How do we get them as a part of this puzzle? And how do we get them to help collaborate across the industry and within the regulators? I know it's quite broad, I'm sorry.
So just for SCE, our executives are very much engaged in our safety culture transformation efforts. In fact, the core takeaways from both of our 2017 and 2020 safety culture assessment has been focused on leaders' ownership, right? So our leaders set the tone. The mantra, in fact, that we have been using is, as the leader goes, so goes the culture. So we regularly provide safety updates, not only our safety culture assessment results, but also our safety culture transformation initiatives and status to the board. And we do so at least on a quarterly basis. We have an executive safety governance structure that is comprised of our CEO and his direct reports that meets monthly to not only understand our metrics and performance, but to also understand cultural intersections with those metrics as well. We conduct regular pulse surveys. So apart from our triennial safety culture assessment cycle, we have quarterly pulse surveys that we bring to that body to also discuss and understand the extent to which it needs to be shifts in how we are approaching our safety culture transformation. And our governance structure does not only include our highest executives, but there are levels all the way through our grassroots in the organization that connects in a multi-directional fashion to ensure that we do have streamlined communication going up and down the organization as well. So our effort is very much led by our leaders. We recognize that if we can shift our leaders, we ultimately will shift our culture. And I'd say probably one of the strongest examples of this is the fact that our cognitive behavioral training that really set the tone for a shared mindset, shared vocabulary, shared actions and culture. We spent 5 days training our leaders. We invested for 5 days in training our leaders because that's where our inflection point was, right? We also provided training for employees, of which it was 2. But I would like to think that the level of investment that we provided for leaders is indicative of our recognition of the importance there. The last piece I'll say in terms of the industry collaboration is that members of our board, so Tim O'Toole, for example, who sits on our Safety Operating Committee, which is a committee of our broader board, also sits on the board of the National Safety Council. And it is very much a factor that shows up in all our discussions in terms of encouraging our leadership to reach out to NSC, reach out to other industry members to not only validate our approach, but to learn from a best practice perspective as well. So we're very much integrated with our leaders. They're very much leading this effort as well, all from the executive down to our frontline leaders. And we recognize that it will take everyone rowing in the same direction to get us there. But absolutely begins with leader safety ownership.
And I would add to that, to your express point, is in Emma's slide, slide 10, she listed a series of meetings, and our recommendations, we recommended this as well. Hers were more explicit. And we're very interested in exploring all 3 of those. So that's the host quarterly or biannual meetings with IO specific, board of directors meetings among the utilities and with the commission, and best practice annual meetings. So I'm not making a declaration by any means, but those are all certainly wise suggestions, and we're open to that conversation.
I just wanted to give the other utilities a second to respond if they wanted to before moving on to the next question.
I think Melvin and Tom covered it pretty good. We would echo a lot of those same sentiments. I know that in the evolution of our safety culture, the development of our chief safety officer, being involved and having a presence in our senior management leadership is just showing and demonstrating how safety is a component throughout all levels of our company. It gives a voice and a seat at the table so that as they are discussing the movement and direction of our company, safety has a seat there. And so, yeah, I would definitely echo the sentiments that have been given, and that we are definitely focused on trying to ensure that management takes an active role, not a passive role, in this safety cultural shift.
Yes, Gary, thanks. This is Jim with SDG&E. I absolutely spot on with that. It's the same kind of process that we're using. Our chief safety officer is engaged, involved, communicates up and down. Holds monthly meetings with members of our workforce and our leadership to talk about incidents that have occurred. You've got a lot of engagement, built, and it's continuing to build. And I think it resonates when you see the top leadership taking that role and carrying it, taking it farther than perhaps it's ever gone before. It resonates, and the workforce, not everyone, but a lot in the workforce appreciate that, because it speaks to these very issues that we're trying to address. Is how do you have a non-punitive environment? How do you learn rather than scold, or whatever the term might be? So, and then those officer level of dialogues also then move up to our boards of directors, and there are discussions at the boards about topical issues, conditions, and I think that's where that opportunity is to share cultural advancements, if you will. I'm not in those, but I think that's one of those dialogue opportunities, to Dr. Cooper's point. And I hope that helps a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So next we are going to move to Matthew. You can come off mute and ask your question.
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Matthew Carley. I am the supervisor for safety policy with the Public Advocate's Office's safety branch. First off, I would like to thank Safety Policy Division, the utilities, the commissioners, Dr. Schulman. This has been a fascinating and interesting conversation. So thank you for facilitating that. We certainly appreciate the value of collaboration between all actors and institutions in driving safety culture improvements. That said, I do want to speak a little to this point about trust, both between and of institutions. Obviously, we want for there to be an open dialogue on safety issues. We don't want the utilities to feel constrained in bringing safety concerns to the commission. Safety is and has to be our top priority, but I don't think we should elide over the reasons why trust is lacking between utilities, the commission, the legislature, et cetera. I am concerned that the commission and the utilities here may be putting the cart before the horse. We're in a position of holding these safety culture workshops and investigations and rulemakings because, frankly, there's been a breach of public trust. If we and the utilities had highly functional safety cultures, we would not be having this litany of failures that have been killing Californians, destroying homes, resulting in evacuations. Safety can be enhanced by shedding much needed sunlight into the culture and operations of the utilities. It's diminished when we sort of cloak it in secrecy and have closed door meetings. So we recognize the value of collaboration, but I think we all have a public responsibility here to be transparent. So my question, I guess, is just first steps. How do we go about building that trust? What steps can we take to facilitate creating a regulatory landscape where the public can trust that our institutions are acting in the public interest?
Maybe I'll pass it to Dr. Schulman to maybe respond to that question based on the work that you've done, or Dr. Cooper.
I was afraid you might tell us that to me. I don't quite know how to answer it exactly. There are many layers to this issue of public trust. One of the layers in the past that has bothered me in a way is that we have treated the public as infants when it comes to risk. Most of the agencies are constantly reassuring, oh, don't worry about it. We are regulating this. We are caring about this. And the utilities say that as well. And the fact is that people have to understand that there are risks. And that one of the things that happens is people make themselves more vulnerable to the risks as they become more dependent on complex systems and infrastructures, or as they move into areas that are more heavily forested. And so there are always these kinds of trade-offs. I think, you know, you're dealing in gas, for example, with the very explosive materials under very high pressure with thousands of miles of line that cannot be directly controlled by a single utility. There are risks. Yes, things can be better. But in many respects, in the areas that I originally did my research in, nuclear power and commercial aviation, the public dread of the accidents turned out to be a major political foundation for regulators and for the utilities providing these services to spend a lot on safety, even when rates went up. So I think in a way, part of this issue is not simply the public has been lied to and conspiracies have undermined its safety, which may be true in some senses, but we have to recognize as users that there are risks associated with some of these systems. Obviously, we can do a lot better. We may have to pay more to do better, and we have to understand that may be the facts. High reliability and safety does not come cheap, And so these are choices. And I think that maybe the way to start this is to stop giving reassurances to the public of, oh, well, it wasn't safe now, but now it is, which makes them basically too trusting and in some ways not skeptical enough about the service, but also puts them in a position where their hopes and expectations are going to be dashed by the next accident. Some of these things are risky propositions. I know that doesn't sound like the correct answer to something like this, but I think foundationally, we need to look around to really understand this problem. This is a problem in public psychology, as well as in organizational actions and failures. So, I mean, I think that's part of the equation as well. As I was saying earlier, I think it's important for regulators to tell the public just how difficult it is to regulate for safety culture. And that this is a job that they're going to be having to learn, not to expect the public to assume that they know everything about it, and thus every failure must be a failure of will or design or incompetence. That isn't actually the case. It would be a good thing as a foundation of trust for people to be honest to all of the stakeholders and participants about exactly what the challenges are and about the need for some learning to take place. I think it was mentioned earlier, one of the things you get if you get an improvement in safety culture is you find out there are more events and near misses. So that is part of a message that needs to be communicated to the public, that in many respects, learning about near misses is a good thing, because when the FAA learned about it, it learned a lot more about its system than it did before. Those are positive things. So, there's no magic bullet here. It's a complex problem, but I think there are many, many dimensions to it.
Matthew, I think that your question that you had it's a very hard question because it gets to the face of the matter. When we're looking at incidents that are occurring, sometimes we try to address the actions, what could have been prevented, what should we have done. And right now, what we're talking about is trying to address the culture. What do we prioritize? And it is a discussion that we're involved in, and we're hoping to be able to communicate across our utilities. With that being said, human nature, it's hard for us to have our faults and any mistakes highlighted and showed. What has to happen is a desire to get past that, to be able to be, as you stated, transparent with some of this information. And I think that's where some of these dialogues take place. Like with the NRC, there was a multiple year dialogue of going back and forth with the utilities, the commission, the public, finding out what each prioritized so that that cultural shift could take place. And I think that as we tried to bring together and collaborate to find out the public interest, the commission's interest, the utilities interest, the concerns from each of these parties, that's where our cultural shift is going to begin and going to happen. We're going to change the focus of our priorities. Yes, we've done very well being able to get employees to personally invest in their safety. The question is, can we get them to holistically look at all the different forms of safety, our communities, our systems, our environment, as we get them to take those focuses that have been internal and really take that holistic view and culturally shift each of these individuals, not at a top level, but personal, throughout all levels, the managerial, the frontline employees, the contractors that we're involving. This is going to be a process we're willing to work through and willing to invest in. But I think that as we do that, you will see an improvement throughout the utilities, trying to focus on more involvement within the responsibilities of safety that are overarching.
Thanks, Gary. Go ahead, Dom, or Dr. Cooper, sorry. You're on mute still.
Is fine, Emma. I'm quite happy with that. I was build, I mean, what Gary said was kind of music to my ears. He didn't mention the public, which was a bit of a shame. And I'm thinking back a few years ago where very vast organization right across the US and Canada, so North America per se. And we were looking for this cultural shift. We knew the data that we'd got from the cultural assessment, but we now need to make it work. The quickest way we could make it work was to hold town halls, literally. So we had the leadership who never prior would go to the guys in the different places, and we're talking literally cornfields in Iowa or whatever, you know, agricultural places down in California, where they would just go face to face. The leaders would go face to face with the employees where they were. So the principle is, how can the regulator, how can the IOUs go to the constituents, which at the end of the day is the public? This is all for the benefit of the public and keeping the public safe, and we're not ruining communities and so on. So what do they want? How do you know what they want? The only way you're going to know is to go out and talk with them. But also, what are you doing? You can share your improvements. Hey guys, we are very concerned about safety culture, and use the term safety culture or culture of safety. We're very much interested in community safety. We're very much interested in IOU safety and contract safety, employee safety, all of these different kinds of safety. But this is what we've been doing. So directly tell them what you've been doing. Where are you at in this journey? Okay. What areas of opportunity? Be honest, as Dr. Shulman said. Be honest. You know, we're lagging in this area, or we think we're lagging in this area, we think we're lagging in that area, but it is on our radar. We're trying to prioritize by risk, and I understand the difficulties with risk assessment and all the rest of it. But then ask them, what would you think would be the most priority? What would you add to this? Are we in the ballpark of your concerns, yes or no? And it's not just a PR exercise. It should never be just a PR exercise. It should be, as Dr. Shulman said, being honest and saying, this is the state of play, this is where we're at, this is what we're trying to do, we need your help, you tell us and what we should be focused on, and let's see if there's any alignment there, and bring the public with you. And then one of the lessons I've always learned across 3 decades of doing safety culture work is to give people the feedback. If people give you information, it's moral and ethically sound that you then go back to those people and say, hey, we heard what you had to say, and this is what we've done with it. We were able to do this. We're still looking at this, but we haven't been able to do this because it costs too much, or we just don't have the resource, or we just don't have the people, whatever it is. But again, it's honesty, and people appreciate that. Oh, you can't do anything yet, but thanks for letting me know. We'll keep an eye on that. We can give you some kind of dispensation in the reputation and that kind of stuff. So what I'm trying to say here, this is real stuff that we've been doing for 3 decades within organizations, very large organizations and global organizations often. But we've been able to change the culture from literally starting with these town halls and saying, this is where we are, this is what we're trying to do, this is what we're not so good at, sorry, we've got areas of opportunity here. Are we all in alignment here? Are we all on the ball? What do you all think? And get some feedback. And it's time consuming. It's going to be resource intensive without a doubt, but it's probably going to be one of the most valuable things that you can think of doing, because you're now showing the public that they are a stakeholder. They're not an add-on. They're not an extra. They're the main stakeholder, because everything we do is serving them. And I think that's something that really does need to come into this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. I'm just going to draw attention to Joe's comment from Pacific Corps about the fact that while a lot of the safety culture work originated in the nuclear subsector, there's a lot of similarities, and there's truth in the idea of trying to prevent incidents across the electric industry. And then I'm going to quickly respond to Melvin's question in the chat, which is how will the safety culture data collected from inspections and audits be used by the commission? And just say that I think the slide that we had presented was really just like an ideas phase at this time. So we have not gotten there, but I would assume that if we went forward with that idea, we would continue our work of trying to learn from other industries and how they have done that. And there's a lot of work that's been done to create indicators that are then used in inspections and audits in those other industries. So I'm gonna go ahead and pass it to my colleague, Ken Koss. We're a little bit behind schedule, but he's gonna help us with a facilitated discussion. We have a few questions here. So I'll pass it over to Ken.
Hello, everybody. We have about 20 minutes left. So, brief, concise, but certainly want some input. You see the 3 questions on the screen. Just general kind of closeout questions, but if you have any other ideas, certainly bring that up as well. So the first general question is, what do you think of some of the ideas that we've heard today from either the PUC, Dr. Schulman, and or the utilities? We've talked about it a little bit already. And Dr. Cooper just mentioned a priority of getting the public involved so that they truly are a stakeholder in this culture build. Anyone else have any comments on this? Side questions? Are there any priorities that you feel might have not been discussed today that you have in your head, or you've been thinking about or thought about as we went through this afternoon? I guess question I have for the utilities would be this idea of the town halls. It sounded like, I forget actually who, might have been PG. Somebody mentioned that they're doing something like a town hall. Is there an outreach effort within the utilities to either do a town hall or reach out to the public more than you have been?
PG&E reaches out extensively to the public, and I'm not the right person at PG&E to talk about that. But I would refer back to the recommendations we had that Melvin presented at the end of our slide as a way to address that, is to sort of take an orderly, collaborative approach to kind of setting these priorities and these steps.
Any of the other utilities, anything to add on that or comment?
With SoCalGas, we definitely do town halls, and I think really having a focus on safety throughout each of our town halls, despite the topic, and really engaging the public. I think that feedback loop that Dr. Cooper talked about, and really getting the information back to those levels, are great suggestions that we need to make sure that we're utilizing in all of our communications to our the stakeholders we engage through public town halls.
Good. Anyone else from the utility side or even non-utility side?
Yeah, for SDG&E, well, it's similar to what SCE just said. We're engaged in public, town halls or fairs, so to speak. I know we just embarked on some wildfire safety fair activities. Sometimes they're driven by a project, where we're proposing to build something, and sometimes they're based upon a topic such as wildfire safety, which is a very high visibility item, and we do a lot to educate the public about what we have in place. What are the things we've done to try to minimize the risk? What are the structures that we put in place, or features, or tools, or and so on, and how are we continuing to build on those? So that's one example.
good. Thank
comes
you.
to mind because it's right now.
Mhm. Mhm. Does anyone else have any
I think
comments? Go ahead.
If I can add one more thing, I'm sorry. Just in general, we have one of the items on the utility slide deck had to do with, kind of level setting of where are the cultures now. And if we're looking at how, at a priority, it strikes me that you kind of have to know where you stand before you move off of that spot. So I don't know if that's just I don't mean to be repetitive of what we said already, but that, we need a starting point. And that, I'm not sure that we've seen, well, what are we? I mean, we talked about a lot of things that each of us is doing. Many of them are similar, and scopes may be different, but how does that stack up? And how does that, where are we strong in some areas and where are we weak? I think that sort of an assessment needs to be the first part of building the culture, is to understand what it is now.
Mm-hmm.
So and I'm not sure. I don't know how that works. I mean, what are all the things that have to happen to make that happen? But it seems like that should be a primary focus early on, is to say, well, all right, how do we get that assessment? What does it look like? What are the things that are going to be asked of the utilities for, how are they doing things, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a small endeavor by any means.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I think, well, we have 3 more questions, and reading these through, each one by itself could be a whole session, 3-hour session if you wanted to really get into it and do a deep dive in each one of these. But just going over the 5,000 foot level on number 2, we kind of talked about a lot of these already. Does anybody have anyone, but the utilities or other participants have any other ideas toward building trust, creating opportunities as far as information sharing? I do think, like I said, we've had some pretty good suggestions already, but is there anything else out there we haven't touched today?
Again, I think for number 2, the proposal of an INPO-like entity is appealing. I'm not sure if that's the ultimate solution, but it does seem that you need some sort of a third party that engages in that dialogue, so it sort of proctors what the exchange between the commission and the IOUs. Mm-hmm. and gets another perspective. It's a parallax view that can help advance the dialogue and build the trust. So that's what I would say about that.
I'm glad you brought up the INPO part of it, because I had a question myself that I was going to attach to either number 3 or 4, but it's for you folks. In the INPO outlining, you talked about a ranking and how it leads to competition. To me, that could actually be a disincentive to building a safety culture, where the scoring competition becomes more of the issue than actual culture building. I mean, has anyone experienced a ranking / competition environment? And if so, positives or negatives attached to it?
I could just say one thing about, I've had some experience in some of the research I've done in nuclear power plants with INPO. They are not formally a regulator, but they look a lot like a regulator in the behavior they have that they have and induce from the plants. They do inspections of the plants, and they send people around to look at everything, down to the workbenches in the maintenance units. And they write all kinds of comments, and if people were trying to hide stuff, it would be pretty hard from these INPO people, because they know what's happening in those organizations. The other thing they do, which I don't like, is they have an annual meeting. They bring plant managers in and they shame the ones whose inspection reports were bad. I mean, public shaming, it sounds like something that medieval, but that's one a process that they use. I wouldn't recommend that, but I just think that IMPO has a lot more of a role of inspecting and watching and commenting and sort of incentivizing, let's say, plants to do better, even though they're not a formal regulatory agency.
I'm smiling a little bit, Paul, because we internally have talked about the public shaming element of some of these programs, but no, it does not lead to collaboration. That's for sure. Well, again, looking at time, we'll jump down to number 3. And this is a tough one. I mean, again, it could be a whole session unto itself. How can we ensure that these initiatives have IOU buy-in? And my sub-question to that is IOU buy-in from the executive level, management level, and staff level. It could be 3 different events. But if anyone has any comments on any of those things, but just general IOU buy-in and involvement. For utilities in your presentations, you've talked a little bit about building involvement, both at the staff and executive level. And I had a side question on that, which relates to number 3. One of the utilities talked about communication, and I think what it was is vertical communication, lateral and vertical communication, fostering safety culture and looking for buy-in. Do any of you have programs that are specific to vertical communication, from executive board to the person who's taking the phone call for the complaints, or the person who's operating the machine to build the structure, dig the hole, drive the truck down the road safely? Are there any programs that focus solely on the communication process?
Within PG&E, of course, there's a massively extensive communication process from the CEO all the way down to the lowest level employee. It's exhaustive, it's daily, it's hourly, it's pervasive. Any input or learnings that we could get from anywhere would be gladly received.
Anyone else have comments on that or questions?
Hey Ken, can I just make a comment that the only real, in my experience, any real way to get IOU and buy-in and involvement is for the folks who are doing whatever they're doing to own the process, to have an input to the process, to have a commentary on it, to help guide and nudge, which I guess is what we're doing here to a large extent, which is really good. But it has to be that the people have to be involved in the decision making, and it has to be genuine. There has to be a genuine impact of that joint decision making, and then you get that ownership. And I think that the CPUC, I'm going back to Britain, where we introduced the goal setting regulations in 1975, 1990s for the management of health and safety at work regs. We had, you will do this, a prescriptive approach, and then it switched to, funnily enough, when safety culture was coming in to Britain, into the landscape there, to goal setting regulations where, hey guys, these are the kind of things we want to do, whatever. And the guy said, and the company said, okay, there's the framework, and off they went and they did their things. And then if the regulator came by and said, well, look, this is what we've done to satisfy this framework. So They did what they needed to do to suit themselves. And I think it's important to stress with safety culture, exactly the same thing has to happen. You can give the tools, people can do the assessment. So for example, let's say we have a corrective action process. A lot of corrective action processes fall over because they're not resourced correctly. But different companies have different types of corrective action processes. The principle is they've got a corrective action process, but they've developed something that works for them. And it may be that with the best practices that we were talking about earlier and the guidance that the industry would like to see, I think that's a fair comment, my understanding of what was said earlier, that within those parameters of those best practices, they can put something together that works for them in light of the systems that they already have. And sometimes companies have one system that does everything. I'm thinking of SAP, and other companies have got disparate systems that somehow talk to each other in some places and not in others. So there's this whole thing that these organizations have to go through to make sure that whatever the best practices are that come out of these assessments, they can implement in a way that works for them, but still satisfies the regulation. So there's ownership there. And I think last week's working group was very much on this issue of ownership and flexibility and so on. So I think that might be the wisest way to approach it. So, hey, look, here's some opportunities for you. How are you going to address it? Does it work for you? Is it working? And does it satisfy the intent of the regulations vis-a-vis safety culture?
Thank you. Going forward, question number 4, we have 4 minutes left. We want to give Emma some time to close out and have some closing remarks. But I think instead of trying to answer this question, if you all either mentally or physically cut and paste this question, put it somewhere where you're looking at it a lot. And it's an ongoing question. It's an ongoing effort that we all would need to look at, think about, and take with us as we go forward. So I think instead of trying to answer it here, we'll just use it as a rhetorical question to say, what are we going to do as we go forward? And then maybe revisit it as we have workshops 3 and 4 and beyond. But ultimately, this is one of the real overriding questions of the whole piece here and our whole effort. But, you know, how do we know this is working? How do we know it's improving safety and reducing harm? Lots of ways to do it, lots of things to think about, but just take that with you as we go. And with that, 3 minutes left. So Emma, I'll turn it back over to you to close out.
Thank you, Ken. Just very quickly, I'll just say that our next steps are the 2 additional technical working group meetings for July, and that we'll also be collecting written feedback on questions that and topics that we discussed in the first 2 technical working group meetings together shortly, so in the next few weeks. And with that, I just wanted to pass it to Commissioner Houck and to Director Thomas Jacobs for any closing remarks.
Just want to thank everyone for their participation today. I think we had a really good discussion, and it's important that we keep a lot of the things in mind that we heard today. We do need transparency, we need trust, and we need accountability to ensure that we get to a place where we're looking at results. And that last question that Ken talked about is first and foremost here. How do we get to a point where we're seeing results on the ground for more positive safety culture and safer systems? I think Dr. Schulman's point about being honest with the public about what risks are will help us have some better discussions about this. And Dr. Cooper's comment about going out to the public and talking to them and looking at where we're at right now, what things are being done, and how can we and are we making progress is going to be absolutely critical to how we get to where we want to be. And we're going to really need to rethink how we've been doing things to get to that place. And again, a lot of great discussion today, and I appreciate everyone's participation and look forward to our workshops in July.
I just will reiterate Commissioner Houck's comments. I really deeply appreciate all of the work and effort and thoughts folks shared, both the folks who formally presented and the comments and questions from the various participants. Really personally excited about the work that's happening here. Clearly, it's going to be very hard. This is a complete reorientation, I think, in some ways, of specifically, again, in my case, the electrical corporations on wildfire safety. So it's not easy. But clearly, we've got a lot of people that are very focused and motivated on it to do something about it, including at the commission, at the utilities, at my department, and certainly I think our broader stakeholders as well. So appreciate the efforts folks are putting into helping us move the state forward on reorienting how we address a safety culture to truly drive changes in behavior that create a safer system for the residents and customers of California. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Houck, and thank you, Director Thomas Jacobs, and thanks everyone for attending and sticking with us this Friday afternoon. Please reach out to us if you have any questions, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Signing off.